So the next island that Odysseus and his men stop at ends up being the home of Polyphemus, a Cyclops, and importantly, a son of Poseidon. But they don't know the inhabitants, they don't know who lives here when they first land. But abiding by the rules of hospitality, Odysseus makes sure that he and his men bring a gift, because if you remember, guests, if they can, should supply their hosts with a gift for following hospitality. So they go ashore and leave the rest of the ships, the rest of the crew, kind of out in like the harbor, I guess, and they go inland and they find a massive cave with goats and sheep, ram, there are crates of cheese and a big fire, and it's kind of a dirty cave, but they notice some olive branches in the back, and so that word olive branch should definitely be triggering a memory in our minds. And eventually they meet the Cyclops, who thunders in, and immediately they begin to see that this was not a good idea, that this host will not follow the rules of hospitality. So Polyphemus disses the gods, he disses their dumb rules, he's not following them. He grabs up two men, bashes their brains on the ground, and eats them for dinner, and really isn't bothered by their presence at all. You know, after he eats his man flesh for dinner, he just goes to sleep and leaves the rest of the men kind of cowering in the back of the cave. And Odysseus knows that they can't just kill him, because why? And so Odysseus starts to come up with a plan of escape, and this is where we get to see some of his major character traits at play. Odysseus uses a number of different implements in his escape plan, so we can see why he's the favorite of Athena, because he is so clever. So he uses lots, fire, wine, the wordplay with nobody, the olive branches that they noticed in the back of the cave, and then the Cyclops, Polyphemus, they use his own rams in their escape plan. And you can kind of see here the men who are hiding underneath each of the rams. We can kind of see their faces hidden. So you should know how each of these is an important element in how Odysseus escapes. But while he is so clever and so intelligent, at the end of this episode, we see one of his downfalls, one of the famous downfalls of Greek heroes, and that is this term down here, hubris. So Odysseus and his men, they get to the ships, they're escaping. Polyphemus is blinded, and Odysseus just can't resist saying, hey, if anybody asks you who did this to you, tell them it was me, Odysseus, son of Laertes. And he goes off on this big rant telling the Cyclops his real identity and just boasting about how he bested the monster. And so with that knowledge, Polyphemus is able to curse him, to curse his journey home, to curse his men. And we see the balance here between fate and free will of which is more powerful in determining men's fates. So think about who is creating the problems in this journey, who is keeping Odysseus from his goal of returning home. And so Polyphemus cries out to the sky, cries out to his father Poseidon, and you should make like a checklist of that curse to see which of them comes true. So Odysseus is feeling pretty good about himself. He bested the Cyclops, Polyphemus, and he and his men are off onto their next leg of the journey. And they come to a floating island called Aeolia, and they meet King Aeolus. And Aeolus is the king of the winds. And he's in a constant state of celebration with his sons marrying his daughters, and they just have a big wedding feast all the time. And so Aeolus extends hospitality to Odysseus, and he ties up the winds into a big oxhide bag so that Odysseus can use the winds to carry him home. And so they sail for 10 days. They get so close in their ships that they can see the shores of Ithaca. And it's at this point that Odysseus falls asleep. And who can blame him? He's a hero. He's tired. He's had a long journey. And so he falls asleep, and his men start to argue about what's in the bag. And we start to see some more depth in their relationship with Odysseus, that for some reason he did not tell them what was in the bag, and that they didn't necessarily trust him. They think that he's keeping something from them. And so we kind of wonder where this rift started, when it started. And so his men open the bag. They can see Ithaca. They open the bag, and I like to imagine it like a big whoopee cushion, and it blows them all the way back towards Aeolia. And when Aeolus sees that Odysseus is back, obviously Odysseus is angry. He's heartbroken. They came so close to home. When King Aeolus sees that Odysseus has returned, he refuses to help again. Why? What keeps King Aeolus from helping Odysseus after this horrible thing happened and brought them back? Why doesn't he just give him the wind again? So Odysseus is feeling pretty good about himself. He bested the Cyclopes, Polyphemus, and he and his men are off onto their next leg of the journey. And they come to a floating island called Aeolia, and they meet King Aeolus. And Aeolus is the king of the winds. And he's in a constant state of celebration with his sons marrying his daughters, and they just have a big wedding feast all the time. And so Aeolus extends hospitality to Odysseus, and he ties up the winds into a big oxhide bag so that Odysseus can use the winds to carry him home. And so they sail for 10 days. They get so close in their ships that they can see the shores of Ithaca. And it's at this point that Odysseus falls asleep. And who can blame him? He's a hero. He's tired. He's had a long journey. And so he falls asleep, and his men start to argue about what's in the bag. And we start to see some more depth in their relationship with Odysseus, that for some reason he did not tell them what was in the bag, and that they didn't necessarily trust him. They think that he's keeping something from them. And so we kind of wonder where this rift started, when it started. And so his men open the bag. They can see Ithaca. They open the bag, and I like to imagine it like a big whoopee cushion, and it blows them all the way back towards Aeolia. And when Aeolus sees that Odysseus is back, obviously Odysseus is angry. He's heartbroken. They came so close to home. When King Aeolus sees that Odysseus has returned, he refuses to help again. Why? What keeps King Aeolus from helping Odysseus after this horrible thing happened and brought them back? Why doesn't he just give him the wind again? So without any wind, Odysseus and his men are stranded. They're kind of stuck drifting for 6 days at the island of Aeolia before they finally make their way up to Lastragonia, number 6. And you know it's going to be good when the city is represented by skulls. So stay tuned. So when they reach the harbor of this unknown land, all of the ships except for Odysseus's sail into the harbor. His is the only one that remains on the outskirts, which is a little odd to me, a little suspicious. So for some reason or another, Odysseus keeps his ship away from the rest of the ships in his fleet with all of his men. And so they approach, they go ashore, and they're still curious. What is this place? What are the people like here? Will somebody help us get home? And so lucky for them, the Lastrygonians are a people of man-eating giants, and they've stumbled into the city of Telepilis. And when the inhabitants discover them, it's a slaughter. The only ship to escape, the only people to escape are those in Odysseus's black ship. Everything inside the harbor is destroyed and sunk and ended. And so all of Odysseus's company is narrowed down to this one ship. So the one ship left makes it to the next island, and Odysseus's men are just quiet, depressed. They're sad over the loss of all of their friends and their fellow soldiers. They're crying, they're mourning, they're depressed, and Odysseus almost scolds them a little bit for not being helpful, because despite everything that they've lost, despite the tragedy, they're not home yet, and so their journey has not been ended. Their quest is not fulfilled. And so we see Odysseus's kind of second in command, one of his men who seems to step up, and we've seen him before. His name is Eurymachus. And Eurymachus leads a group of men into the island a little bit farther, where they come across a big stone house. And in front of this house, there are all of these wild animals, mountain lions, and dangerous beasts and wolves who are just sitting like happy little dogs. And so they make their way in, where they accept a drink from a beautiful woman, and what do you know, it turns them into swine. So this is how we meet Circe, the enchantress. And so she takes all of her little men pigs and just pens them up in a pen like you would do to pigs. And Hermes appears to save Odysseus from the same sorcery. And so he offers him an herb, and Odysseus goes in, and when he drinks the poisoned wine and doesn't turn into a pig, she's like, "Oh snap, you must be Odysseus," and immediately falls in love with him and welcomes him, and like offers him a hot bath and a bunch of food and a lot of hospitality. And he is like, "Well, that's great, but you turned all my men into pigs, so I'm just not sure if this is gonna work out." And so she turns them back and offers them just food and welcome and feasting, which is a great relief after the tragedy of losing so many men in Lastrigonia. So notice how long they stay with Circe, enjoying all of this hospitality. They stay there for a year. A year passes before it's not even Odysseus who says it may be time to go now. He says that one of his trusty comrades turns to him and says, maybe now the time has come to think about your native land once more. So we see that Odysseus wants to get home, but he's maybe enjoying himself a little here and doesn't have a sense of urgency about returning that maybe Penelope has been feeling for the past 13 years. So Odysseus begs Circe to send them home, and she graciously agrees, but she also tells him that before he returns to Ithaca, there's a different journey that he must complete. She tells him that he needs to go to the home of Hades and dread Persephone, to the underworld, because there's a prophet there who will give him warnings and news and advice on finishing his journey. And this is a big, scary, horrible thing. He says, "How can I go to the underworld?" And she is so helpful. She says, "Oh, well, I know exactly what you should do." And she offers him instructions and directions to go on his journey. And that brings us to the end of book 10. So a few things to review as we look back over what we've read so far. Odysseus is still in the Phaeacian court. He's still recounting his adventures to King Alcinous, to Queen Arete, and their daughter Princess Nausicaa, who is, making some googly eyes at him. So some things that we want to consider as Odysseus retells the stories is how accurate are his retellings. His men are not there anymore. For some reason, they have all died or gone or been separated, and he's going to continue to fill in those blanks for us. But how accurate is his retelling? Is he painting other people in a different light than how things actually were? And what makes you think that? So the next few books where he's going to continue to catch us up on his journey, because he's gotten himself all the way up to the island of Circe, but we still don't know how he gets from Circe to Phaeacia, so he needs to finish telling us what's happened. The last thing is that epic heroes embody the important traits of their culture. And so as we look at Odysseus, we are seeing a picture of character traits that Greeks valued at that time. So we need to consider what traits seem to be the most important to the Greeks. What about Odysseus makes him an example of what it means to be a Greek hero? If we think of Captain America as being an American epic hero, what traits do Americans value that he has? And the same with Odysseus. If we consider Odysseus Captain Greece, what traits about him are the most important to Greek character?